In this video, I'm going to show you a couple of image effects, and these are some of the most powerful image effects here besides color correction. Actually, color correction, in my opinion, is probably the most powerful image effect here. But obviously, the best way to use this stuff is to stack it together on top of your camera and use multiple image effects to achieve a completely new look. Now, to make this look even better, what I'm going to use is a couple of powerful image effects. One of them is called Vignetting, and the other one is called Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. We're going to talk about Vignetting first, okay? And we're going to apply that to our camera. So I'm going to take the main camera. I'm going to go to Component, Image Effects, and if you go down here, it's one of the last ones. It's called Vignette. I'm going to select that. Let me collapse color correction there and expand Vignette. So we have a couple of settings here. Now, Vignetting, if you come from a background with lighting and color and things and visual effects and film and things like that, you're going to understand what vignetting is. You're also going to understand what chromatic aberration is. If you don't know what any of that stuff is, I'm going to show you right here. Vignetting is basically a darkening of the edges of the image, okay? And this can sometimes be seen in movies and film and things like that. It can also be seen sometimes in games. Some games actually use this. A game that uses this heavily, and not to sound too repetitive, but I'll have to cite it again, Killzone 2 uses this quite a bit. What vignetting does, if I increase the intensity, you'll notice that the edges of the screen become darker and darker, almost like if my eyes were closing slowly. See that? So obviously, if we exaggerate the effect, it almost looks like we're looking through a little cutout hole, maybe in a cardboard box that we have over our head or something like that. Which, well, you know, if that's the effect you're going for, you could use that. Vignetting looks good if you use it slightly. So, I mean, a value of 0 means no vignetting, but if you start to increase this to something like this, this actually looks pretty good. So we have a darkening of the outside of the image. So you can use that if you want. If you don't, you can set it to 0. The other option here is chromatic aberration. Now, chromatic aberration is basically an abnormality that happens when light gets split up by something like glass. Like you see things like in a prism, a glass prism that splits the wavelengths of light. It could take white light and split it up into red, green, and blue in different colors. Okay, chromatic aberration does something slightly similar. It's basically an anomaly that happens with lenses. Chromatic aberration can be seen in film. Sometimes with film cameras do that actually naturally. It can make your game look much more realistic. So if I increase chromatic aberration by a lot, you're going to start to notice that I get this weird effect where the image becomes distorted and the colors of the scene begin to get split up. So you can see the greens are separating from the reds. So you don't want to use too much chromatic aberration unless you're purposely trying to go for that type of effect. Maybe you're a robot or something, and this is how the robot sees. He sees through some kind of a lens that is irregular or something like that. Okay. The best way to use chromatic aberration is to use a very slight amount. Use just a little bit of it just to give the effect, and don't overdo it. So if I set this to 0, this is no chromatic aberration. If I start to increase this a little bit, it might be hard to see in the video, but if you're following along on your system while you do this, or when you're working in Unity, you'll be able to see the effect a lot better. So once I add a little bit of chromatic aberration, and I look around in my scene, it might be a little bit hard to see, but you'll see this clearly when you're working inside of Unity. You can start to see that the game looks a lot more realistic. The lighting looks more realistic because that chromatic aberration effect, even though if I asked someone if they could spot it, they probably wouldn't be able to. But your mind, your eyes can see it, and the human eye, very, very peculiar at paying attention to detail. So the human eye could catch little details like that, like vignetting, chromatic aberration, and that just helps to make your game look more realistic. So I actually teach how to use chromatic aberration in my production mental ray tutorials that I've for Autodesk software like Softimage, Maya, 3ds Max. So I use mental ray, and in mental ray we actually use chromatic aberration to make photorealistic renders look more realistic and more believable. Now you can use it in Unity in real time with little to no performance drop for your games. Make your games look that much more realistic. We also have finally a blur vignette setting down here. What this does, it works just like vignetting, but instead of making the edges of the screen black, it blurs them out. So it can be almost like a character has something in focus, or you can think of all kinds of cool effects you can use that for. I'm going to set that to 0. I don't want to use any blurring right there. I'm going to keep my chromatic aberration at about 1, my vignette to about 4. Looks pretty good. I like the way that it looks. Okay, so the next effect that I want to talk about is something called SSAO, which stands for Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. It basically adds more ambient occlusion to your scene. I already added some ambient occlusion when I did light mapping with Beast earlier, but I can add extra ambient occlusion, and this ambient occlusion is actually calculated in real time. Okay. Now the good thing to use in Screen Space Ambient Occlusion in Unity is that it makes your scenes look more realistic and makes them look much better. The downside to it is it's pretty computationally expensive, so it does take a good performance hit on the engine and on your hardware. So only a good computer should be running with it on. But since this is a next-gen game tutorial, we're going to go ahead and have a look at how to use it. So make sure your main camera is selected. I'm going to go to Component, Image Effects, and select Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. As usual, this is Unity Pro only feature. Okay. So if I go ahead and I turn the effect off, have a look over here where this wooden pallet is holding up this this oil drum over here. Have a look also behind these little wooden boxes on this shelf, and look at that pillar right there from the support beam. Okay. When I turn it on, I get these really beautiful contact shadows that appear instantly right there, and that's all being calculated in real time. This real-time ambient occlusion can make your game look even more next-gen and really elevate it to that AAA title type of quality. Now the settings that we have are radius settings. Radius is going to determine how far out the ambient occlusion goes, so if you play around with it, if you increase and decrease the settings, you can see the ambient occlusion kind of moves around a bit. I like using a default, which is 0.4. That works out pretty good. The sample count is a pretty important parameter. This will determine how fast or how slow it renders out the effect. So if you set it to high, you're going to get the best quality effect, but it's also going to hurt your performance real bad. So you got to be aware of that. If you set it to low, your performance will improve, but the quality of the ambient occlusion may not look that great. And what I mean by not looking great is you may get flickering and artifacts that appear to be flickering when you move around your scene. The occlusion intensity does, as the name suggests, it makes the effect darker or lighter. So if I drop it, basically I'm getting rid of the ambient occlusion. If I increase it, the ambient occlusion becomes pretty intense and very dark. So it depends on what kind of look you're going for. Then we have blur. You have to be careful about blur. The more blur we add to this, the softer the effect is going to look, so any artifacts will start to kind of get blurred away. The problem is if you increase blur too much, you're going to hurt performance, because the more blur that you have to do, the more calculations have to be made, and that hurts performance. Downsampling also hurts performance or increases depending on what you do. If you increase the downsampling, see if I increase it all the way to 6, the ambient occlusion gets worse. It starts to look all speckled and starts to get artifacts, does not look good at all. But the ambient occlusion will render out really fast because we have more downsampling. So if you want the ambient occlusion to look really good, you would want to set the downsampling to 1. That would give you the best quality ambient occlusion. Problem is, it takes longer to render and it can hurt your performance pretty good. The default setting is 2. The occlusion attenuation determines how far out the occlusion can go. So if I reduce this, the occlusion almost disappears. If I increase this, the occlusion becomes darker, more refined, kind of spreads out a little bit more. I like keeping it at 2, looks pretty good. The min-z value, I recommend leaving this alone. As I start to play around with this setting, I can pretty much cancel out the occlusion effect. So I don't like to change the minimum z. You really shouldn't have to change the min-z setting at all. Okay. All right, so that's the ambient occlusion. If I go ahead and I play this game right now, you can see as I look at objects that have contact shadows, like where the floor meets that pillar, see that dark area right there? That's the real-time ambient occlusion. And it can make your game look that much better. A lot of next-gen games use this. Games like, if you've played Aliens vs. Predator, the recent one that they made for the Xbox 360, that game uses a lot of ambient occlusion, and it looks pretty nice. So you could see here where the walls meet each other, we have this dark ambient occlusion right there. I recommend only using it if it's going to make good visual impact on your scene, and also if you can optimize your game and make it run with the ambient occlusion without taking a huge performance hit, because the last thing you want to do is add this effect and then the performance of your game drops down so low that when gamers play your game, they'll get frustrated because your game is pretty much running in slow motion. I hope that gives you a very good understanding and shows you the kind of effects that you can use to make your game look more polished, more not just realistic, but allow you to control the style of the game and make it look visually appealing to the player, and also make your game stand out. A quick example of something that you can do real quick with these image effects before I stop this video. Say, for example, you want to do something that looks like maybe a surveillance camera. What you can do is maybe come up here and, let me go to image effects real quick. Let me add a grayscale to this to make it black and white. Then let me go ahead and add a fisheye lens to make it look like this. Kind of a fisheye lens here, looks pretty cool. And let me go and add a noise effect, which makes it look like we're looking through some kind of a surveillance camera. Okay, so by adding different effects like this, just by adding 3 different effects, I was able to achieve an effect that looks like we're looking through a surveillance camera. So say, for example, we're creating a game where the main character is being attacked by zombies, and he locks himself up in a security room in this warehouse, and he's looking at the warehouse through a surveillance camera that kind of pans back and forth like this. You can set up a camera for that for a real-time cutscene and have zombies kind of wandering around the warehouse, and the player is kind of looking at that and going, oh my, there's a lot of zombies out there, I can't step out there right now, I got to try to find another way out of this warehouse, so on and so forth. So I think you get the idea. You can also use something like this to do a camera effect like what you see in the Splinter Cell games, if you ever played that, using the snake camera that you stick underneath doorways or underneath doors that allow you to recon a room and see if there's any enemies inside the room, what kind of weapons do they have, how many enemies are there. Really, the possibilities, again, are endless. So let me remove, and let me remove. All these different image effects will allow you to do an unlimited different types of styles and looks to your game. So feel free to go in there, play around with that when you get a chance, and come up with some really cool stuff. Okay, so that's going to do it for post-processing effects and image effects inside of Unity 3.0. Hope you enjoyed that. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and move on to some other topics here as we start to wrap up this tutorial.